For weeks, people have asked the same question. If Nolan Wells's friends really believed he stayed behind on Horn Island by choice, why has the story continued to generate so many questions? Now, one of the only friends willing to speak publicly has broken his silence after the release of the emergency audio call, and while his interview doesn't answer every question, it does offer a clearer picture of what that day may have looked like from inside the group itself. At the same time, investigators continue reviewing digital evidence, witness interviews, and forensic findings, while the FBI remains involved in supporting the investigation. Tonight, we're going to slow everything down, not to prove a theory, not to accuse anyone, but to carefully examine what actually happened on Horn Island based on publicly available information, official statements, and the timeline investigators have been working to establish since July 4th. Before we go any further, one fact deserves repeating. No one has been charged in connection with Nolan Wells' death. The Jackson County Sheriff's Office remains the lead investigative agency, and the FBI has confirmed it continues providing assistance. The investigation remains active, meaning many of the questions surrounding that day have not yet received official answers. That brings us back to the beginning. Horn Island sits roughly 10 miles off Mississippi's Gulf Coast. On most days, it's quiet, known for its untouched beaches and wildlife. But every 4th of July, the island becomes something very different. Boats begin arriving early in the morning. Families gather along the shoreline. Groups of friends anchor nearby. Music carries across the water. People spend hours swimming, talking, and moving from one gathering to another. According to publicly available reports, Nolan Wells made that same trip with a group of friends on Independence Day. At the time, nothing suggested the day would become the focus of a nationwide investigation. Nolan had recently completed his first year at Southwest Mississippi Community College, where he played football. Friends, coaches, and family have consistently described him as someone who was quiet, respectful, and dependable. His parents have publicly spoken about his kindness, while former coaches remembered him as someone who led more through his actions than his words. For Nolan, the trip to Horn Island was supposed to be a break before returning to football workouts. Instead, it became his final day. According to statements made publicly over the past several weeks, the group spent much of the afternoon enjoying the holiday. At some point, Nolan separated from his friends and began talking with a young woman named Katie. That conversation has become one of the most important moments in the entire investigation. Not because investigators have said anything criminal happened during it, but because it represents one of the last confirmed moments Nolan was seen alive. Katie has reportedly told Nolan's mother during a face-to-face meeting that Nolan planned to head back toward his friends after they finished talking. That detail is important. She described what Nolan intended to do. She did not publicly state that she watched him actually get back onto the boat. That difference may seem small, but investigators know it matters. Intentions and actions are not always the same. People change plans. They stop to speak with someone. They become distracted. They decide to stay longer. Without independent evidence, investigators avoid assuming what happened next. Meanwhile, Nolan's friends have consistently maintained that Nolan stayed behind when they departed. For many people following the investigation, that's where the questions begin. If Nolan planned to return, why didn't he? Did something delay him? Did he decide to remain longer? Or is there another explanation investigators haven't publicly disclosed? As of today, officials have not answered those questions. Before we go further, it's worth looking at another event that changed the direction of the entire afternoon. The emergency call. According to publicly released recordings, someone from the group contacted a marine assistance service after reporting that the boat was taking on water. The caller explained that the bilge pump had stopped working and requested help. During the conversation, the dispatcher asked a series of routine questions. Where are you located? How much water is entering the boat? How many people are on board? Do you need additional emergency assistance? Those questions have since become some of the most replayed moments in the case. Not because the questions themselves are unusual, they're standard during marine emergencies. Instead, people have focused on the responses. Some listeners believe portions of the conversation sound confused. Others point to pauses or changing answers. Still others have concentrated on background noises heard before the dispatcher even answers the call. According to publicly available information, however, investigators have not confirmed many of the interpretations now circulating online. That's an important distinction. Listening to a recording is one thing. Determining exactly what it proves is something entirely different. Experienced investigators understand that emergency calls often sound disorganized. People dealing with stress, poor cell reception, loud surroundings, or rapidly changing circumstances don't always communicate clearly. That's why detectives compare emergency calls with physical evidence rather than relying on audio alone. Here's where things become more complicated. Shortly after the emergency call, another conversation reportedly took place involving the boat's owner. According to the publicly released recording, a representative from the towing service indicated that the boat owner's grandfather had called separately and advised that assistance was no longer needed at that moment. That portion of the call immediately drew attention online. Some questioned why help would be canceled after the initial report suggested the boat was taking on water. Others pointed out there could be entirely ordinary explanations. Bilge pumps can begin working again. Water levels can stabilize. Mechanical problems sometimes resolve enough for boats to continue operating safely until they reach shore. Investigators have not publicly stated that the cancellation itself indicates wrongdoing. Still, because it became part of the official timeline, it remains one of many details detectives continue reviewing alongside witness statements, GPS records, and forensic evidence. As today's interview from one of Nolan's friends continues spreading across social media, investigators are likely asking a very different question than the public. Not whether every statement sounds convincing, but whether every statement matches the evidence already collected. Because in investigations like this, memories can differ, evidence cannot. And according to officials, one category of evidence may ultimately become more important than any interview released so far. A collection of digital records investigators have reportedly been examining for weeks that could either reinforce the timeline already known or reveal that one critical moment on Horn Island unfolded very differently than anyone realized. As investigators continue piecing together the events of July 4th, one question keeps resurfacing. What actually happened after the emergency call ended? For many people following this case, the emergency audio became the centerpiece of the investigation. But detectives know that a phone call, by itself, rarely tells the entire story. It's only one moment within a much larger timeline. According to publicly available information, the call was placed after the group reported that their boat was taking on water near Horn Island. During the conversation, the caller described problems with the vessel and requested assistance. The dispatcher gathered information, including the boat's reported location, the number of people on board, and whether additional emergency services were needed. Those details became part of the official record. What happened next has generated just as much discussion. According to the publicly released recording, while the caller was waiting to be transferred, the towing company's captain received another call, this one from the boat owner's grandfather. During that conversation, the grandfather reportedly stated that assistance was no longer needed and that he would call back if the situation changed. That exchange immediately raised questions online. Some people wondered how a boat described as taking on water could suddenly no longer require assistance. Others pointed out there are several ordinary explanations. Marine mechanics note that boats experiencing water intrusion don't always continue sinking. A bilge pump may begin working again. Someone on board may manually remove water, or the source of the leak may become manageable long enough for the vessel to continue traveling. Investigators have not publicly stated that the cancellation of assistance indicates criminal activity. Instead, it remains one event within a much larger investigation. Before we go further, it's worth looking at what happened after the boat left the area. According to publicly reported GPS information, investigators have been able to reconstruct much of the vessel's route following its departure from Horn Island. Rather than focusing only on where the boat traveled, detectives are interested in something even more important. When it traveled. Time is often one of the strongest forms of evidence. Unlike memory, electronic records don't become uncertain because weeks have passed. A GPS record either places a vessel somewhere or it doesn't. A phone either connects to a cell tower or it doesn't. A photograph either carries a timestamp or it doesn't. That's why investigators compare digital records against witness interviews. If both tell the same story, confidence in the timeline grows. If they don't, investigators begin asking additional questions. Here's where another important development enters the picture. One of Nolan's friends has now spoken publicly in greater detail than before. Naturally, many viewers immediately began comparing his interview with statements released earlier in the investigation. Did his account match previous interviews? Did he remember additional details? Did anything change? Those are reasonable questions. But investigators understand that memory often develops over time. Someone who initially remembers only broad events may later recall smaller details after repeated interviews or personal reflection. That doesn't automatically make either account inaccurate, nor does it automatically make either account completely reliable. That's why every statement is tested against evidence. Meanwhile, another part of this investigation continues receiving renewed attention: the digital evidence. According to statements made publicly by Nolan's family and their legal representatives, investigators have continued examining electronic devices connected to the case. While officials have not released the results of those examinations, digital evidence often becomes one of the most valuable investigative tools available. Phone records, location history, messages, photographs, application activity. Every one of those records can help detectives establish exactly when events occurred. Unlike witness interviews, electronic records frequently provide precise timestamps. Those timestamps can either support witness recollections or identify areas investigators need to examine more closely. As of today, investigators have not publicly released the complete findings from those examinations. That means many of the conclusions currently circulating online remain speculation rather than established fact. There's another reason this investigation continues attracting national attention. The FBI recently clarified its involvement through a written public statement. For weeks, speculation surrounded the Bureau's role. Some believed federal agents had assumed control of the investigation. Others argued their presence suggested evidence of a much larger criminal case. The FBI's statement offered a different picture. According to the Bureau, the Jackson County Sheriff's Office remains the lead investigative agency. Federal resources are being provided to support local investigators where appropriate, including assistance involving interstate threats connected to the case. That clarification answered one important question. It also reminded the public that federal involvement does not automatically indicate criminal charges are imminent. Investigations involving multiple agencies are common, particularly when specialized forensic resources or digital expertise are required. As detectives continue reviewing interviews, GPS information, emergency communications, and electronic evidence, one fact remains unchanged. No official agency has publicly announced a final conclusion regarding what happened to Nolan Wells on Horn Island. That means the investigation continues moving forward, one verified piece of evidence at a time. And according to people closely following the case, the next major development may not come from another public interview at all. Instead, it could come from evidence investigators have quietly been reviewing behind the scenes. Evidence that may eventually explain one critical gap in the timeline that has remained unanswered since the very first day of this investigation. As more interviews continue to emerge and investigators work through the growing amount of evidence, one thing has become increasingly clear. This case is no longer being defined by one piece of audio or one witness statement. Instead, it's being built or challenged through the combination of every interview, every digital record, every GPS point, and every confirmed event that investigators can independently verify. That's how modern investigations work. Detectives don't begin with a conclusion. They begin with facts. Then they ask a simple question. Do all of these facts fit together? If the answer is yes, the timeline becomes stronger. If the answer is no, investigators keep digging. That process is exactly where the Nolan Wells investigation appears to be today. Before we go further, it's worth returning to one detail that has quietly remained at the center of this entire investigation. The final confirmed timeline. According to publicly available information, investigators know when Nolan arrived at Horn Island. They know he spent part of the afternoon speaking with Katie. They know the boat later reported mechanical problems. They know an emergency assistance call was placed. They know the group eventually departed the island. They know Nolan was reported missing later that evening. And they know his body was found 2 days later. Those are the broad outlines of the timeline. The unanswered questions exist within the spaces between those confirmed moments. What happened after Nolan finished speaking with Katie? Who saw him next? How long was he alone? Did anyone else interact with him before the boat left? Those questions remain central to the investigation. As one of Nolan's friends continues speaking publicly, many viewers have focused on whether his account aligns with everything previously reported. So far, investigators have not publicly stated that his interview contradicts the official investigation. That doesn't necessarily mean every question has been answered. Witness statements are only one part of the process. Investigators still compare those interviews against objective evidence before deciding how much weight each statement should receive. Here's where another important piece of the puzzle comes into focus: digital evidence. Unlike memory, electronic records don't become less reliable because time passes. Phone activity, location data, call logs, messages, photographs, application usage. Each one creates a timestamp investigators can place directly onto the timeline. When several independent digital records point toward the same sequence of events, detectives gain confidence that they're reconstructing the day accurately. When those records don't align, investigators begin asking additional questions. That's why forensic analysis often continues long after public attention begins fading. The public may move from one headline to the next. Investigators remain focused on the evidence. Meanwhile, renewed attention continues surrounding the emergency audio. Some people remain convinced they hear hidden conversations beneath the hold music. Others argue the recording has been interpreted far beyond what can actually be confirmed. According to publicly available information, no official forensic analysis released by investigators has confirmed the specific phrases many listeners claim to hear. That distinction remains important. Investigators don't solve cases by asking what people think they hear. They solve cases by determining what can actually be verified. The emergency call still serves an important purpose. It documents the reported mechanical problem. It establishes approximate timing. It records information exchanged between the caller and the dispatcher. Those confirmed portions become part of the investigative timeline. Everything beyond that requires additional evidence. Before we continue, there's another aspect of this case that deserves attention: public pressure. Few investigations receive the level of national attention this case has attracted. Every interview is analyzed. Every photograph is enlarged. Every social media post is discussed. Every rumor spreads within minutes. That kind of attention can be both helpful and challenging. On one hand, increased awareness sometimes encourages new witnesses to come forward. On the other hand, misinformation can spread just as quickly as verified facts. That's one reason investigators have continued urging the public to provide original evidence rather than edited clips or repeated online claims. An original photograph, an unedited video, a first-hand account. Those are the kinds of evidence detectives rely upon. As investigators continue moving through that material, another question remains unanswered. Will the evidence ultimately support the timeline that has been described publicly since the beginning? Or will one overlooked detail force investigators to rethink what happened during those critical hours on Horn Island? According to officials, that determination has not yet been made. The investigation remains active. The Jackson County Sheriff's Office continues leading the case. The FBI has confirmed its ongoing support. And Nolan's family continues waiting for the one thing they have been asking for since the very beginning: the truth. Because regardless of how many interviews are released, regardless of how many theories appear online, regardless of how many times the emergency audio is replayed, only verified evidence will determine what actually happened on Horn Island that afternoon. And investigators believe some of the most important evidence may still be sitting inside reports, forensic examinations, and digital records the public has not yet seen. As investigators continue reviewing every piece of evidence connected to July 4th, another question has quietly moved to the center of the investigation. Not where Nolan was found, not even who last spoke with him, but whether every person connected to that afternoon has described the sequence of events the same way from the very beginning. That's an important distinction. Investigators understand that small differences in memory are normal. Two people can witness the same event and remember different details days or even weeks later. What detectives look for are not tiny inconsistencies, but significant contradictions that cannot be explained by normal human memory. So far, officials have not publicly identified any witness as intentionally providing false information. Instead, investigators appear to be doing what they always do in complex cases: comparing every interview against objective evidence. That objective evidence includes GPS information, emergency communications, digital records, and forensic findings. Before we go further, it's worth looking at something many people overlook whenever a high-profile investigation unfolds. Evidence has different levels of reliability. For example, someone may sincerely believe they remember a conversation happening at 3 o'clock when it actually happened at 3:20. That's a normal limitation of memory. A digital timestamp, however, doesn't rely on memory. Neither does a phone record. Neither does a GPS location. That's why investigators spend so much time comparing witness interviews with electronic evidence. When both tell the same story, confidence increases. When they don't, detectives begin asking why. That brings us back to the interview released by one of Nolan's friends. Since it became public, viewers have carefully examined nearly every sentence. Some believe his account answered several long-standing questions. Others believe it created new ones. At this point, investigators have not publicly stated that the interview changes the official timeline. What it does provide is another first-hand perspective from someone who was present during part of that day. Whether that perspective ultimately aligns with all available evidence remains part of the ongoing investigation. Here's where another important issue enters the picture: public speculation. Very few cases remain confined to investigators once they receive national attention. Instead, thousands of people begin examining photographs, replaying videos, enlarging screenshots, and listening repeatedly to audio recordings. Sometimes those efforts uncover useful information. More often, they generate theories that investigators must later separate from evidence. That's exactly why officials continue urging people not to confuse speculation with confirmed facts. One example involves the emergency audio. Since the recording became public, countless versions have appeared online. Some contain enhanced audio. Others include captions created by individual content creators. Still others claim to reveal conversations hidden beneath the background music. According to publicly available information, investigators have not confirmed many of those interpretations. That doesn't necessarily mean they're impossible. It simply means they have not been officially verified. Experienced detectives know better than to base conclusions on recordings whose meaning remains disputed. Instead, they compare the recording against everything else collected during the investigation. Meanwhile, another important question continues receiving attention. Why has the FBI remained involved throughout the investigation? According to the Bureau's public statement, federal agents have continued supporting the Jackson County Sheriff's Office by providing specialized resources where appropriate. The statement also confirmed that federal involvement includes addressing interstate threats connected to people involved in the case. What the statement did not announce was any federal takeover of the investigation. Jackson County investigators remain responsible for directing the case. That clarification helped address weeks of speculation that had spread online. As detectives continue reviewing witness statements and forensic evidence, another reality has become increasingly apparent. Much of the evidence the public continues discussing represents only a small portion of what investigators are likely reviewing. Search warrants, laboratory reports, digital forensic examinations, private witness interviews, cell phone analyses. Those materials rarely become public during an active investigation. Instead, detectives quietly compare them until they believe the timeline is supported by evidence rather than assumption. That process often takes much longer than people expect. For Nolan's family, every additional day means another day without complete answers. Publicly, they have remained focused on one request: a thorough investigation. They have consistently asked investigators to follow every lead, interview every witness, and examine every available piece of evidence before reaching conclusions. That request continues today. Authorities have also maintained their appeal for anyone who was on Horn Island during the 4th of July weekend to provide original photographs, videos, or first-hand information. Even something that appears insignificant could help investigators establish another piece of the timeline. A photograph may capture someone walking through the background. A short phone video may reveal exactly when a boat arrived. A witness who thought a conversation wasn't important may later remember a detail investigators have been searching for. Those seemingly ordinary moments have solved cases before. As today's interview continues circulating and public interest remains high, investigators are almost certainly focused on a much narrower question. Does every piece of evidence point toward the same sequence of events? Because if the answer is yes, detectives move closer to understanding exactly what happened on Horn Island. But if one critical piece of evidence points somewhere else entirely, the investigation could take a very different direction. And according to officials, investigators are still working to determine which of those two possibilities the evidence ultimately supports.